Today, I have the great honour of speaking with Paul Williams. And Paul is a multi-award-winning crime journalist, author and broadcaster, with also a master's in criminology. And we will chat about the evolution of organised crime in Ireland. Hi, Paul. A pleasure to have you with us. How are you doing today?
Good afternoon, Patricia. It's a pleasure to be with you as well. It's the first time I've ever done something like this, so forgive me if I'm a bit clunky.
Oh, I'm sure you won't be, Paul. But first question for you today is, where are you located and what has been keeping you going over the last few months?
Well, I'm in my garden shed, where everybody seems to have a garden shed in Rathfarnham, where I do my work generally. And what I've been doing since I made full use of the pandemic and the lockdown, because I wrote two more books, and I've been keeping myself busy with all kinds of things and writing for the Irish Independent et al. And preparing for this interview.
Fantastic, Paul. So you are a crime journalist, author and broadcaster. Can you please tell our audience more about your roles and what makes you so passionate about what you do?
Well, I've been involved in writing about crime since I joined the Sunday World and came from the country. I was at provincial newspapers for a few years after I left college, and when I arrived in the Sunday World at the time, it was an area that wasn't really being fully utilised or explored. And it was also 1987 was a year when there was an explosion of serious crime with people like the General, the Monk, the INLA, the IRA, you name it. The country was seemed to be in the grip of a sort of a crime epidemic at the time. So inevitably, I got involved in it. After that, I started to study criminology. I got more interested in the wider issues around crime and crime causation and all of that. And why am I passionate about it? Because I've been doing it since, and I think you become fairly passionate about a subject when two of your friends have been shot dead, murdered deliberately, assassinated for what they did, Veronica Guerin and Martin O'Hagan. I lived, and my family lived with police protection for something like full-time 12, 13 years, including part of that time with two armed bodyguards. Others of my colleagues have been threatened many times. So as a friend of mine one time said, you only get flack when you're over the target. So we must be doing something right. We were annoying these people to some extent, I don't know why, by writing about what they do. And what I've done and what my career has been involved in, I suppose, and I've written 12 books now on this subject, is I have chronicled and witnessed, and in many ways feel privileged that I witnessed the evolution of organised crime. In fact, I witnessed a very sizable chunk of our social history as it evolved and chronicled it. And I've seen it going from the 1980s being just what organised crime would principally be described by as groups of gangs coming together to carry out armed robberies, to becoming to the likes of the Kinahans today, multi-national, one of the biggest drug trafficking organised criminal groups in the world. And that has been a very long journey and an extraordinary journey to watch. So for all those reasons, I suppose that's why I've still tried to call myself a crime journalist.
Wow, that's incredible. And I am sure our audience will have a lot of questions about that. They're already coming in, Paul, for you. So we're going to move quickly on. And so you've already touched upon it, but your title, The Evolution of Organised Crime in Ireland. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about this?
Well, I would like to, when I do talks for groups of people, to explain to them, and I did, one of my books was actually about the history of organised crime in Ireland. It is a phenomenon that we can actually trace back to 1969, 1970, quite literally. And historians will tell you this, that it's always very convenient when you can start at a year or within a couple of years. And it coincided with the outbreak of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And the Troubles in Northern Ireland spilled down here in the sense that the provisional IRA tried to undermine the authority of the state here for many years, and also funded their war by robbing banks. On the back of that, they inspired a large group, a significant cohort of young men who had come from the margins of society, some of them, and they decided to take advantage of this. People like the Dunns, the Cattles, the Cunninghams, the Kinahans, and a fellow called Martin Cattle, the general who was the head of the Cattle family. And the term we use is that in the shadow of the gunmen, these people started to learn their trade and they started to rob banks. And quite literally from the 70s on, you saw this massive upsurge in armed robbery and armed crime. Then it begins to change in the late 70s into the 80s when we see the heroin scourge, which comes along and basically exposes the deep social inequality in our society because of the fact that heroin became a major epidemic and problem in the poorest parts of Dublin City, primarily in the North Inner City and the South Inner City. And criminals were the people controlling that. And criminals realized the prodigious profits that could be made. The decade moves on, and then we see armed robberies continue. But then there is a transition, a shift from the late 80s, principally because the police get just as good as the criminals. They start shooting them, and it becomes less attractive. But also at the time, so-called civilized Irish society are getting turned on by drugs. They like their recreational smoke of hash, principally at the beginning. And then we see the continuous slide and shift into drugs as the mainstay of organised crime, like in everywhere else in the world. And that's one of my books, my last book, Gilligan, about John Gilligan. I said he's the man who changed the face of organised crime in Ireland. He was the guy who placed a business structure, a coherent business and distribution and financial structure on the whole business of organizing and importing mass shipments of drugs and selling them and recouping your losses and all of that, or recouping your supply and continuous supply. And then we had the noughties, which again, as I say, the evolution of organised crime in Ireland parallels the evolution of Irish society. Ireland fell in love with cocaine. And as a result of that, from the late 90s right through to today, and all of your viewers and listeners will be well aware of this, we fell in love with cocaine. And what it is, we fueled a €1 billion industry, at least €1 billion industry a year. And that on the back of that, the young, more volatile criminals who came along began killing each other purely because that's the way to do business. It's all about treachery and greed and double crossing each other. And that was probably best exemplified when Veronica was murdered in 1996. That was at the start. But in 20 years later, in 2016, when we saw the outbreak of this appalling gang war called the Kinahan-Hutch feud, and carried out principally by the Kinahans, who killed 18 people in a very short period of time, which really did hit Irish society in a big way, scare them. But the big point I have ultimately going forward is two questions. One is that there is an issue around drugs and the international war on drugs. It doesn't make any sense anymore because nobody's winning anything. And two, you had to ask yourself as well, how come the most marginalized areas of society were affected most by this gang war when the Kinahan gang inflicted absolute terror on the North Inner City, which was the home of the Hutches. But one of the last thing I would say in relation to that, in terms of the evolution of organised crime in Ireland, and going back to the war on drugs, the best way to describe it is like gardening. It is a bit like trying to keep the weeds down in one part of your garden. You don't let it go out of control. And what has happened in Irish society in policing terms is that we let the weeds grow very high. Like John Gilligan got out of his box, murdered Veronica. The Kinahans and the Hutches all got out of their boxes, and they brought the whole society. They felt that they could wage war openly on the streets. We saw it in Limerick. So I think the big lesson there is it's about maintenance. Because as long as the people in legitimate society want to get stoned, then we will have organised crime.
So I myself have a lot of questions. There are so many coming in, but very, very quickly, Paul, before we move on to the plethora of audience questions I have for you. We in UCD Discovery are very passionate about interdisciplinarity. It seems like it's also very important in your role, but maybe just very quickly shine some light on that.
Well, I actually, we talked about this before, Patricia, and I also talked to Joe Carty, the legend. I hope he's there somewhere. But interdisciplinary approach to dealing with social and criminal issues. Criminal issues are on the back of social issues. For many, many, many years, when I started studying criminology first back in 1990, there was only a 2-year certificate course or diploma course, and that was held in DIT. Now, then UCD led the way. I think it was in 2000 they had the first proper faculty of criminology. But what do you find, and I've studied policing theory and policing history, is that police by their nature are very conservative and they're very resistant to change. But as we developed and began, police officers coming in had higher levels of education. they began to realize how important academic research is in the whole field of criminology, and it is vital. And there are so many areas. One that I would talk about is, like, very briefly, you know, how the way we interview and conduct interrogations, when it's interview methods in this part of the world, was based on academic research and psychological research. And it has proved to be hugely effective. I've done a few papers on it in college myself about it, like the Graham Dwyer case. That was very, very much a brilliant example. The questioning that went on in that case, that was an example of academics helping the police to understand how to interview people and get the information out of them. Unlike in America, where they still have an interrogative system where they effectively bully people into confessions, and then you get an awful lot of cases, a very disproportionate number of cases of miscarriages of justice and innocent people going away. So absolutely, academia and policing are now very much embraced with each other. That is something, again, which I've noticed in the past 20 years that has completely changed, and that is very important. So you know, you have your own case, your own course there, Joe Carty set up for international law enforcement, which is a huge accolade for UCD to have. That they have a world-class course that teaches people from the FBI, the CIA, the DEA, and I hope I'm not giving away any secrets and I don't cause UCD any trouble over that, but I think that's fantastic, and that to me epitomizes that. Also in UL, there is now a course for law enforcement professionals on the whole concept of criminal assets recovery, which was parented by officers from the Criminal Assets Bureau. So go back to your original point, Patricia. I'm sorry for breaking my time scale. It is hugely important, and it is proving to be very, very successful.
There are so many questions here, and Joe Carthy is on, and there are so many questions here for you. We've got probably 4 or 5 minutes max. We're going to try and get through them pretty fast. Some really interesting ones. What was responsible for the success of Irish criminals in the UK?
The fact that they were English speaking, that they were white, that a lot of them, when they went to the UK, like the Duns, would have done time in the UK and UK prisons. So there was more, because the English don't like speaking other languages, the Irish don't like speaking other languages, and there was a sort of a natural sort of, as much as Republicans wouldn't like it, but we're very alike. So I think that is one of the base reasons why they got on so well together.
Is there any place in the world where organised crime does not exist? Any nice place, that is, in brackets.
But by the way, one of the things about organised crime is that you don't realise you have a problem with organised crime until you see the manifestations of it. And the most obvious manifestation of organised crime in society is when they start killing each other and violence blows up. Because, like, for example, cocaine didn't just become a problem in 2016 with the Kinahans. It was there for years. I was writing about them 10 years earlier, and they were building this vast empire, but it only comes to the surface and you only see it. It's like vermin infestation in your garden. You only see them when there is an infestation. You won't see them when there's a small number of them. They're ticking along, life is grand, and then you start seeing them. When you start seeing them, that's the time to call in rent-a-kill. But in practically every society in the world has some form of criminality, obviously, wherever there's human beings with people breaking up. But in terms of organised crime, one of the things is a serious crime boss would ask me that same question, Patricia, because the first thing he would do, like a businessman, an international entrepreneur, like they are entrepreneurs and innovators, is he go, I want to go to that place because I want to set up a nice quiet life for myself there.
Okay. So lots of questions around this and about citizens' assembly on decriminalisation of drugs. But it's a lot of complicated, multifaceted questions here for you, and we are gonna, I'm putting them to you, and they're long questions, but maybe just a brief overview. If there was a legalization of drugs, would that solve gangland crime?
I don't think it would, because you have to, in order, the whole concept of decriminalizing drugs, people believe, is to take the money away from criminals so legitimate people can enjoy drugs. I think it would have to be much more nuanced than that, because the criminals will just break over and break out and start. And they're already doing it in places where cannabis is legitimate, because they can sell it cheaper than the legitimate companies.
Okay, I gotcha. There's a lot of questions around your, writing about crime and risk to your life, and so I kind of anything. So, have you ever published anything? Have you ever not published anything because it would be too much of a risk to your life?
No, and the reason I didn't is purely because you have to remember, I've often written about this, and I always put my hands up, and I won't bullshit anybody. The old mafia term. Sorry, it's not personal, it's business. But for me, when they murdered Veronica and then they murdered Marty 5 years later, it was very much personal for me. So there was very little that I would hold back. Very, very little, if anything. The only thing I would hold back is if the lawyers stopped me from publishing it.
Okay, so it's actually been, so has it been difficult? It says, has it been difficult to find sources to talk about organised crime?
It's much more difficult now than it ever has been, because the various governments have clamped down completely on the police, and a police officer nearly find it difficult to even tell you the time of day now at this stage, which I think is wrong. I think it's bad, and I think they should be more open. They still are very conservative in this country when you compare them to other police forces around the world. We're still living, and there's still a big foot in the dark ages there.
Okay. And so we are completely out of time, so I'm going to finish up with this one. So some quotes from your book, that it's a complex tapestry of relationships in Irish crime, but there's loyal spies and double agents. And to me, when I read your book, it was almost like a movie. So how do we solve this? Can you ever solve organised crime?
No, you don't. It's the same as anything else. It's like climate change. It's part of our lives. It's been normalized. People will that's why it is a very complex issue. As long as there will be people on the earth, there will be crime, because as long as you have a civilized society, you will have people breaking the laws in that society. Organized crime can only, as I use the term or the example of maintaining your garden, trying to keep, the weeds are going to keep on growing, the grass is going to keep on growing. You just have to keep it at a certain height, and that is where we are at that. That's why we really do. There's a big discussion, much bigger than the People's Assembly. It's an international People's Assembly to discuss this nonsense about a war on crime that I think Nixon first enunciated in 1971. And it has gone absolutely nowhere. But then again, you have to ask yourself, why do people want to use recreational drugs? The last thing I would say is it's the really harmful drugs like heroin and cocaine that is having a really damaging, detrimental effect on our societies. That's an issue as well. It's about education, it's about health, and it's also about criminology, it's about law enforcement, it's about sociology. There's a lot of stuff going on there.
As long as, I suppose, social inequality exists, you will have that. We are completely out of time, Paul, and sincere apologies to all of you whose questions I did not get to, but I really wanted to take this opportunity to say an absolutely huge thanks to Paul for the most fascinating discussion today. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you, Patricia, and goodbye to everybody at UCD.
Thank you so much, and I'll see you all very soon on Zoom for Thought. Take care, everyone. Bye. Thanks a million, Paul.